What's up, Dragon Brood? I'm actually really excited to look and see what we have today because honestly, so far what we've seen looks pretty crazy. And this is, in a way, is starting to shape up a little bit like Infinity War or even like Star Wars or whatever, where you set it up where like the bad guys have to win and make things really dark and grim and ugly so it actually matters when the good guys win. I sort of feel like that's what we're doing here. But all that aside, let's hop in and take a look at what sweet cards we have to talk about on today's previews. Alright, first up we have Sword of Forge and Frontier. 3 colorless, like all the other swords. Equipped creature, it's an equipment obviously. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from red and from green. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. You may play an additional land this turn. Wow. Okay, one, I don't know if this means we're going to have a whole other sword cycle with some 3 swords or 4 swords, or maybe over the 2 Phyrexian sets we have coming, we get 5 new swords. I have no idea. But this is really cool. Even if you don't have mana left over to be able to play the top card, like, you can actually just play another land, and that's totally worth it. Now, it's not a May effect. It says you exile the top 2, so you will give up 2 cards, so you have to take that into consideration when you're attacking, because you might lose something that you actually want. But realistically, this is really cool, and it gives you protection from red and green, so you can't really gripe about that. Overall, this is actually a really damn cool card, and I'm probably going to play it in a fair amount of decks, honestly. And if you end up in a world where green decks with Toxic or whatever we call it end up being a thing, or even just mono red or Gruul decks or whatever, like, you know, burn damage ends up being a real thing. People want to play Koth, whatever. This sword actually gains more value. So, like, this is actually a pretty cool one to keep an eye on. And if nothing else, this is surely to be playable in Commander. This was just a random card I thought was worth talking about, but it's a 1 mana 1/2 flyer with Vigilance. So it's got 2 keywords and a second toughness for 1 mana. Like, sure. I mean, admittedly, a lot of the white decks right now want to be like soldiers or something else. But if for some reason you have a reason to want to play this in some artifact build, or you are playing some Phyrexian based thing, this is actually a very quality 1 mana early creature. Jawbone Duelist, 1 colorless and a white for a 1/1 Phyrexian soldier, so more Phyrexians. Toxic 1, being a double striker, is pretty damn cool. A 2 mana 1/1, not great, but double striker, we've seen that before for that same cost and size. This time, though, it comes with Toxic, so your opponent is even more incentivized to block it, not just to not take damage, but not to get double counters. So that's actually pretty damn cool. Now, will it go into any particular deck? Don't know. You probably still want to be able to pump this or whatever, because you might still kill your opponent with actual damage before toxic damage, but it's another option. Monument to Perfection. 2 colorless artifact. Pay 3, tap it. Search your library for a basic, sphere, or locust land. There's some lands from previous Mirrodins that were locusts, and if you had so many of them, they would produce more mana. All colorless mana, I believe. But anyway, search your library for a basic sphere or locust land card. Reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. You can pay 3, and Monument to Perfection becomes a 9/9 Phyrexian construct artifact creature, loses all abilities, and gains indestructible and toxic 9. Activate only if there are 9 or more lands with different names among the basic sphere and locust lands you control. This is so convoluted, right? Like, can you get this to a 9/9? Yes. And to be fair, they at least made it a reasonable body. It has indestructible, blah, blah, blah. But you have to have 9 different lands that are either locust, sphere, or basic. And then pay 3 to get the thing. Like, if your deck for some reason already does those things, then sure, playing this to just be able to search for a land every turn is kind of cool. Partly because you don't have to search as a sorcery and you can just use it. Like, say you're playing a slow, grindy deck and you want to leave mana up for counters, you could just search for something at the end of your opponent's turn, and that's cool. And that's what those decks want anyway, more mana. Beyond that, though, like, if you're already doing that, sure, it'd have to be nearly coincidental, or maybe I only have to switch a couple of lands to make it worth it, because this can go search out all the different types, obviously. But yeah, it feels a little convoluted to get to that as your finisher, but I don't mind including it if I'm already close to it. But realistically, I don't think this is going to have much of an impact on nearly anything. Atraxxa Grand Unifier. 3 colorless, a green, a white, a blue, and a black for a 7/7 Phyrexian Angel. So Atraxxa, which we've seen before, so people are going to dig this. It has Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, Lifelink. Not a surprise, it gets one of each of the different colors' abilities. When Atraxxa enters the battlefield, reveal the top 10 cards of your library. Wow. For each card type, you may put a card of that type among them revealed into your hand, then put the rest in the bottom of the library in any order. Listing types as artifact, battle. Well, we don't even know what battle is. I guess it's a new card. I don't know if that's like sagas or whatever, but artifact, battle, creature, enchantment, instant, land, planeswalkers, and sorceries are the types. Okay, so we don't know what battles are yet. I don't think. No, we haven't seen anything with battle. And also, oddly, the tribal card type is no longer listed. Now, that being said, maybe Wizards is just trying to get away from using the term tribal because it sounds like they're not going to print anymore with that type for various reasons. Check out my podcast if you want to know. We've talked about it previously. By the way, Color of Magic in my podcast if you've never listened to it. But that aside, this card's kind of wild, right? You're going to pay 7 mana, 4 different colors, for a 7/7 Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, Lifelink. That's really cool. A lot of abilities, pretty strong. And then I'm assuming with 10 cards you're looking at, get to put at least 4 things in your hand, unless you just draw terrible. But if you build your deck around it, I assume you get a land, a creature, an instant, and either artifact or sorcery has to at least be reasonable. But I don't know. It's a big multicolor angel. People love it. Atraxxa has a lot of fans. This is probably better as a reanimation target, truthfully, if anything. But who knows? If somebody finds a creative way to play the card, great. But for me, it's probably a reanimation target. All right, next up we have Evolved Spinal Derm. 2 colorless green for 5/5. Phyrexian Beast. So that's a good size for 4 mana. Evolved Spinal Derm enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it. So this is like the 4th or 5th thing that we've seen that references oil. It has trample as long as it has 2 or fewer oil counters on it. Otherwise, it has hexproof. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove an oil counter from it. If it has no oil counters on it, you sacrifice it. Okay, so this starts out as a 5/5 for 4 mana. Has hexproof. And then if it has 2 or less, it has trample. So that's not bad. However, you only really have it on your side of the battlefield for 4 turns. After that, it's dead because you won't be able to remove one during your upkeep and it's just going to die. So, yeah. Actually, not even that. Yeah, because it starts with 4. So, yeah, you get 4 turns with it. So, yeah, not bad. It's a reasonable card. I mean, here's the thing. If you're playing it in something that cares about being modified, and we still have a few things that do, that's pretty significant, especially if you can have a situation where it has both hexproof and trample. That's pretty good. So yeah, this could have a use. I don't know if it's particularly better than some of the other 4 mana things we could play right now is going to be the biggest issue because there's some quality 4 mana things that already exist. But it might be at least worth experimenting with, and if you have something that has like proliferate or is putting more oil counters on things, then you'll just have infinite hexproof because you're never going to run out. Capricious Hellraiser. It's a 3 colorless triple red, so 6 mana for a Phyrexian dragon. 4/4. By the way, have almost all the rares been Phyrexian somethings? That's so weird. Now that I'm thinking about it, most of them have been a Phyrexian thing in rare or mythic. But anyway, this is a Phyrexian dragon. It costs 3 less to cast if you have 9 or more cards in your graveyard. That seems like a lot, but it does have flying, and when it enters the battlefield, exile 3 cards at random from your graveyard. Choose a non-creature, non-land card from among them and copy it. You may cast it without paying its cost. So this is a little bit weird, right? Because you can get this down to costing 3 if you have 9 or more cards in a graveyard. Which there are some decks that just are putting stuff in the graveyard, drawing and discarding, surveilling stuff. So there are ways to get to 9. It's not easy, but it can happen. But let's say you even just had to pay 6 for a 4/4. That's not that great for what the ability represents. Now let's say you do get it on the cheap. You get a 3 mana 4/4 flyer. That's really good. You get a bonus ability. It is at random, though, so it is possible you get land spell and then you just copy the spell because that's all you've got. It's also possible the spells that are there are not something that matters at that point. Maybe you hit like a Fading Hope or something and there's not a target, right? Stuff like that is going to be disappointing when it happens. It's really strong if you're playing a deck that already wants to have a bunch of stuff in the graveyard, but I'm not sure what that is in Standard. Maybe there's room for something like this in Modern, where you're playing like, is it Phoenix, where you're trying to get a bunch of spells and Phoenix is in the graveyard, and like maybe that's a thing. I think this one I'm going to have to wait and see, because I feel like you have to really build a deck to utilize this ability. Now, I feel like if somebody does, it's probably going to be very powerful. But I think for most people, you're probably going to be best staying away from this one. All right, we've got Zenith Chronicler. 2 colorless for a 3/1. All right. Phyrexian Construct, another Phyrexian thing. Whenever a player casts their first multicolor spell each turn, each other player draws a card. Okay. This is actually pretty fun if you have a single color deck or a multicolor deck with a bunch of single color cards in Commander, because then you could just be the friendly person that everybody else is getting to draw cards when somebody plays something, and that's pretty cool. But even in 1v1, I mean, it is a 3/1 for 2, so it's a sizable body. It's colorless, so it can go into any type of aggro deck if you wanted it to. Could potentially be bonus cards. There's not a lot of decks that have a pile of multicolor cards right now. I think that's the one thing I'm trying to process in my head, at least with what exists currently. There's a handful of things that might net you 1 card, maybe 2 during the course of a game, but even then, is that good enough? 2 mana for a 3/1 that gets you 2 extra cards? That seems kind of cool. I mean, on rate, I'd be all right with that. There's no guarantee of the 2 free cards, but a 3/1, maybe it's worth going with. And if you have something that pumps your creatures or artifacts or Phyrexian things or whatever, it probably gets a lot of extra value at that point. Now, the downside is it does say whenever a player casts their first multicolor spell each turn, each other player draws a card. So that does mean if you had this down and then let's say you drew like Urza to pump your artifact, your opponent would get a card off of that. So that's a little tough. You'd have to really build around that so you don't give up value. But it's at least a reasonable card, and I could see some people trying to do something with this, and it might actually work. So this is an interesting one. Nekrogen Rot Priest, 2 colorless, green-black, 1/5, Phyrexian Zombie Cleric, Toxic 2, so if you deal damage, you deal 2 poison tokens. Whenever a creature you control with Toxic deals combat damage to a player, that player gets an additional poison counter. Wow. Has the ability of colorless black-green. Target creature you control with Toxic gains Death Touch until end of turn. This is actually kind of a cool card. We don't know how powerful Toxic's going to be or not yet, but this is really interesting in the sense that now if anything breaks through, it's 2 counters, and you can put your opponent in a bad spot because it's like, okay, if you want to block this so you don't take those poison, you're going to lose something because I can give something Death Touch, right? And it doesn't say even attacking creatures. You can use it on defense too. So as long as you have mana up, you can give something Death Touch to end a turn. And that's going to be difficult on the opponent, especially since this is a 1/5, right? It can block a lot of things. So if you are playing some type of Toxic-based deck, this is a card I would at least consider. I don't know how good it is, but even a couple copies probably goes pretty far. It's an interesting card for sure. Mirin Safehouse, 3 colorless, artifact. As long as Mirin Safehouse is on the battlefield, it has all activated abilities of all land cards in all graveyards. Okay, that's pretty easy to understand. This is a weird one, right? I would just say, in my head, I'm just going to shortcut questions people might have. Assume if it's in the graveyard and does the thing, yes, this card can do it. If it's one of those abilities that allows a card to flip and turn into something else, this will not do that because it just doesn't have a backside to have that other thing. Otherwise, it's probably going to do most of what you think it does. Minor Misstep, 1 blue, instant, counter target spell with mana value 1 or less. Another easy one to understand. All right, so immediate thought, couple of things on this. 1, it says 1 or less, which is pretty cool, not just mana value 1. And that makes a difference because this is a type of card that's not going to be super impactful to something like Standard, but the further back you go, the more powerful this card's going to be because cards are more efficient the older you go back in formats. And if you're playing this in something like Legacy or Vintage, there are some 0-cost things that this can counter, which could be pretty powerful. And this may even find room in a few decks in Modern or even as a sideboard card potentially. Could be good against mono red burn type things with a bunch of like 1 mana stuff. So yeah, this card will definitely get some play. This is the type of uncommon I would not be surprised if we find out 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that this is a $15 or $20 uncommon. I don't think it necessarily get that high. I don't think it's going to be that ubiquitous, but it wouldn't shock me if it climbed up that high. This is a type of card that will always have some value to someone playing those middle to older formats. Staff of Completion, 3 colorless artifact. Tap, pay 1 life, destroy target permanent you own. Weird. Tap, pay 2 life, add 1 mana of any color. Tap, pay 3 life, proliferate. Tap, pay 4 life, draw a card. Pay 5, not life, just 5 mana, and untap Staff of Completion. Oh boy, if I was playing a life game deck, this card's actually pretty strong in the sense that it can just give you mana, it can put extra counters on things. Honestly, drawing a card is big. So there are some life game decks that I have played, and I would consider a card like this. Just being able to get those extra abilities and only having the payment of life is pretty strong. Now, getting to untap it and reuse it, like that's just a bonus if you're at that stage. Like it's just trying to get greedy. But overall, this is actually a pretty interesting card. Is this better for a commander? Probably, but I will say this, at 3 colorless, it can at least find its way into some 60 card decks. I'm not sure which ones, but it at least is a low enough cost, and just being able to pay life for some of those abilities could matter. Now, I feel like what we picked up today is that there are a lot of Phyrexian things. I honestly think there's more Phyrexian things than non-Phyrexian things that we've seen so far. And I don't know if that's intentional and they're just showing a lot of those in the early part of the preview season, just so we kind of get amped up on it or not. Or if it's a matter of like, maybe this is all that's in the set is a bunch of Phyrexian things. So no, so that's something to keep our eye on. And then we found out about battles that we don't know what those are. So I'm hoping sometime in the next like 48 hours or so, we'll see a card that tells us what battles are, and then we can put those into a preview and talk about it. But overall, I did like what we saw today. I think there's some cool cards, some interesting ideas. Not as exciting as yesterday's was, but still some really good stuff that I want to deck build with. But if y'all do want to see yesterday's video and get caught up, I'm going to put the link right here.